Yoga teachers, do you want some tips for teaching beginners to yoga? Do you struggle to know which poses are beginner friendly because poses that feel easy for you are actually hard for your beginner students? Do you struggle to get your yoga students to actually use their props? In this video, I'll be sharing my top 5 tips for teaching beginners to yoga. If you haven't already, hit that subscription button and the notification bell to be notified every single time I post a new video sharing yoga teaching tips. Tip number 1, teach beginner-friendly yoga poses. One big mistake most yoga teachers make is teaching poses that feel easy for them and they think that it will be easy for their students too. This just isn't true. Remember that there's actually 2 types of beginners to yoga. There's beginners who are not new to movement but are new to yoga, and then beginners who are completely new to movement and new to yoga. For the yoga students who are new to movement and new to yoga, they've probably been sitting at a desk all day and they're really tight and stiff. And so a pose that feels easy for you to do, somebody who's been practicing yoga for a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, probably is really challenging for your student who is new to movement and new to yoga. So I want you to take a moment and really think about what poses do you think are not beginner friendly? Here's my list of yoga poses that are not beginner friendly and I tend to personally not teach in a beginner yoga class. Poses like headstand, handstand, a full sun salutation without teaching your students how to do every pose within the vinyasa, within the sun salutation. Half moon, hero's pose, pigeon pose, bow pose, camel pose, wild thing, high lunge, half yogi squat, yogi squat. So that is just a few of the poses that I personally do not think are beginner friendly, and I tend to not teach in my beginner yoga class. I begin to start introducing those poses in my slow flow or all levels class after students feel pretty confident with the yoga basics. There are also poses that aren't really beginner friendly, but I do teach in a beginner yoga class because I teach the most accessible variation of that pose. Now, those are poses something like cow face pose, dancer pose, eagle pose, warrior 3, easy seat, and child's pose. These poses actually in their full expression, I'm putting in quotes because I do not like using that term, but those poses when we teach the most challenging version of the pose are not accessible and not easy for our beginner yoga students. But you can still teach them in a beginner yoga class by teaching a more accessible version of that pose. Grab your yoga props, at least a blanket, 2 blocks, and a strap. And I'm going to show you some yoga poses that aren't inherently beginner friendly, but when we teach a more accessible version of the pose, they can become beginner friendly. So a great example of this is something like dancer pose. So in beginner yoga, dancer pose is really hard. I would not teach this variation of dancer pose because this is not accessible really for most beginners. So what I would do is start by teaching a standing quad stretch. And you could even do this at the wall. Maybe you have them all start at the wall, hand at the wall. And then I might just have them practice the hand grip for dancer. And that might be my dancer pose for a beginner yoga class. Another option is to do this completely at the wall, one hand at the wall, a standing quad stretch, and then do the hand grip. They can pause here and then give the invitation to come into dancer. So that might be a way to make it more accessible in a beginner yoga class. If you don't have access to the wall, just teaching a standing quad stretch and practice flipping the grip. If you have access to the wall, quad stretch at the wall, flip the grip at the wall, and then the option to try dancer pose at the wall. Now another pose that isn't inherently beginner friendly, but you can make accessible to beginners is a pose like eagle. So I wouldn't teach this variation of eagle in a beginner class. This is really hard. What I would do instead is have your students grab their 2 blocks, bring them on at either side of their feet here, and I would teach this as option 1, maybe this as option 2, maybe this as option 3, and maybe this as option 4. Or I would pick any variation of those 4 options. Did you see how using props and teaching it in progressions made it more accessible? This also goes for warrior 3, right? In a beginner yoga class, I wouldn't teach warrior 3 like this. This is, oops, see, I'm even using the wall. This is a really hard pose. So what I might do is start my students teaching it at the wall and then with blocks. So it might look like this. We're at the wall and we're doing warrior 3. So I might teach this And then I might have them grab their blocks, and we'll do the same thing with the blocks. Now with the blocks here, I might give them the option to take one hand, lower it down, take the other hand, lower it down, and then maybe the option to lift both of the hands. But I would teach with the blocks, one hand, and then option to do no hands. Now another pose that isn't inherently beginner friendly, but we can make accessible to beginners is cow face pose. So what I would do for sure is have all of my beginner students sit up on a blanket. And then I would teach one of these two leg variations, leg variation one like this or leg variation like this. I would not teach this leg variation in a beginner yoga class because what tends to happen is the students are leaning to one side, there's a lot of space here and just not comfortable for them. So I would teach this as my most challenging leg variation. And then there's two arm variations I would teach. One is what I call old school gym stretch, and the other one is using the strap. So I'll show you this from behind so that you can see. So this was arm variation one, and then I would teach them cow face with the strap. So that would look like this. So that's a way to make cow face pose accessible to beginner yoga students. Now, another pose that is not inherently accessible to beginner yoga students, but we can make it by using props, is easy C. Actually, sitting crisscross yoga sauce is really hard for beginners. And so a great way to make this accessible is have them sit up on a prop. Right now, I'm sitting up on a blanket. If you don't have blankets at your yoga studio, you could easily do this with one block, or you could even use 2 blocks to create a bigger shelf. And if you have a bolster at your studio, you can easily also have them sit up on a bolster. So I hope that you're beginning to see that poses that aren't inherently beginner friendly, you can still teach in a beginner class by teaching more accessible options of that pose. Tip number 2, teach and demo with props. Don't make props optional. If you want your students to actually use their props, cue your students to actually grab the props. Make it part of the class. Make it part of your cueing. And then you, as the yoga teacher, you actually demo using the props. Even if in your regular practice, you wouldn't use the prop in that way, in that pose, just for the sake of your teaching, you're going to show your students how to use the prop in that way. Does that make sense? I want to give you an example of the difference between making props optional versus not making props not optional in low lunge and triangle pose. So come into a tabletop position. Inhale your right leg back behind you. Exhale your knee to your nose. Step your foot between your hands and then sweep your arms all the way up. If this is really hard for you, you always can take your hands down to your blocks on the tall height. So I want you to hear the difference between that versus this. Grab your 2 blocks, bring them on the low height right underneath your hands. Wrists underneath shoulders, knees underneath hips. Inhale, reach your right leg back behind you. Exhale, draw your right knee to your nose. Step your foot between your hands. Take your 2 blocks, bring them to the tall height here. Inhale, tuck your back left toes, lift your back left knee. Exhale, scoot your left foot back, drop your knee, and untuck your toes. Inhale, draw the shoulder blades together, lift the heart. Exhale here completely. Option to stay here or option to take both of your hands to that right thigh. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Option to stay here or inhale or reach your arms all the way up. Exhale here. Finding your variation of low lunge pose. So could you hear the difference between the first one, when we went right for the arms sweeping up, versus the second one where we incorporated the props into the actual flow. And it wasn't optional, right? I instructed everyone to grab their props. Another example of this is in triangle pose. So I want you to hear the difference between these 2 ways of cueing. Take your hands to your hips, step your left foot back, bring your left toes parallel to the back of the mat. Inhale your arms to a T. Exhale, reach your right arm forward like you're reaching for something. Exhale, take your hand down to a block, your ankle, your calf, your big toe. Reach your left arm up. You might notice your students will look something like this, right? Now, versus this. From mountain pose, inhale, take your hands to your hips. Exhale, step your left foot back. Bring your left toes parallel to the back of your mat. grab your 2 blocks. Take one block right in line with your right heel on the tall height. Take the other block on the low height, making a T position. Now open your arms here. Inhale, reach your right arm forward, forward, forward. Exhale, take your right palm down to your block. Stack, reach your left arm up. Do you see how this actually guided and taught everyone to use their props? So I hope that you're beginning to see that my next tip is to not make props optional, to teach with the props, have everyone in class do the props. Now, what might happen is a student who knows the pose and doesn't want to use the props just won't use the props, versus a student who needs to use the props but feels like they're not good at doing yoga if they use the props, right? We're making props cool. We're making it part of class by cueing with the props. Okay, so here's some examples of how I would use props. So an easy seat, I already showed you, but I'm going to show you again because I really want you to teach this to your students, is sitting up on a block. If that's all you have, a block is perfect here for your students to elevate their hips. And I would just instruct everyone to grab their block. The next pose is actually tabletop. So when they're drawing the knee to the nose to step the foot through, using blocks helps them have more space. So I would teach, you could even teach like all of balancing table here, the crunches, and then knee to nose to step through. Now you already saw how I would teach low lunge with props, but I would also teach half split with blocks, just like this. I would also teach lizard pose with blocks. So that would look like this. I'll show you on my other leg so you can see better. That would look like this, and then maybe giving the option to lower it down to the low height. Or if we want to keep the blocks tall, maybe giving the option to lower the forearms to the blocks. Now I would 100% teach downward dog on blocks for my beginners. So that would look like this. And I would even probably have them bend their knees. And then I would even teach them downward dog to plank on the blocks. And I would have them go through this a couple times. And then I would 100% teach chaturanga with blocks. So how I would do that would be like this. And I normally do that 3 times. Chaturanga, elbows to shoulders, shoulders to blocks, and then to child's pose. Triangle pose, like I showed you, but I'll show you again. Maybe you'll do it with 1 block like this, or maybe you'll do it with 2 blocks like this. Then pyramid pose, so I would definitely be having them use their blocks on the tall height, framing their foot. For stork pose, I would have them put the blocks out in front of them, put their tippy toes on the block, and then you can practice lifting the toes. So this would be my first option. And then this is also really good for hand to big toe pose. You'll do it with a bent knee. The hand can come to the knee. Then you could even do the twist here. For eagle pose, I would also do this, which I already showed, but I'll show you again. Now you can put the block on any of the 3 heights. So it really just depends on your students, but I would use the block like this. And then same goes for warrior 3. I would use the blocks like this. And now for a seated pose, I would definitely use our props. For any seated pose, I would really have the students elevate their hips at least on a blanket and maybe even a bolster. So anything seated, even if we're doing butterfly, wide-legged forward fold, half butterfly, seated tree, I would have them elevate their hips. And then for cow face pose, I know I already showed this, but I want to show you again. I would do it like this, and then maybe with the strap. If you have straps, if you don't have straps, I would just do my old school gym stretch. So like this. And now poses on the back. I mean, I definitely love using a strap for reclined hamstring stretch, right? Instead of having them try and reach for their foot, just using a strap. So those are some examples of poses that I absolutely love teaching props with in a beginner yoga class, and some examples of how I might actually incorporate the props into my teaching. Tip number 3, teach the poses in progressions. This is when you start by teaching the most accessible variation of the pose first, and then you give an option to teach a more challenging variation, and then a more challenging variation. So how you actually teach a pose in progression is by remembering that yoga poses are like a spectrum, and which option or variation of the pose you will teach will depend on who's in your class. So how you teach poses in a progressive manner is first by teaching the most accessible option first, and then teaching your students how to know when to try option 2. And then you'll teach option 2. And then you'll teach your students how to know when to try option 3, and then you'll teach option 3. This really allows your students to feel included in the class. It makes students feel like yoga is for me. They feel empowered, and they also know the path to trying a more challenging option because you literally laid out the steps. This approach really allows your students to explore the poses at their own pace and not feel defeated if they can't do the full expression of the pose. I really highly recommend you avoid teaching the most challenging version of the pose first and then saying something like, if you can't do this or if you can't do the full expression of the pose, then grab your props. This makes students feel defeated and like yoga isn't for them. This is probably not a skill you learned in your yoga teacher training program, but don't worry, this is a skill and you can learn it. It all starts by taking one pose and beginning to ask yourself these 2 questions. How can I make the pose more accessible, and how can I make the pose more challenging? Here's an example of how I would teach tree pose in progressions in a beginner yoga class. Starting in mountain pose. Inhale, hands to your hips. Exhale, shift your weight to the left. Inhale, lift your right heel, turn your right knee to the right. Bring the bottom of your right foot right above your left ankle. Make sure to keep the ball of your right foot on the ground. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Invitation to stay here, or lift your right foot up, place the bottom of your right foot on your calf or your upper thigh. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Option to stay here or reach your arms up towards the ceiling, finding your variation of tree pose. So that's an example of how I teach tree pose in progressions, starting from the most accessible option, going towards the most challenging option. Here's how I would teach stork pose in progressions. So I'd have them grab their 2 yoga blocks and bring them on the tall height right in front of their feet. Again, starting in mountain pose, inhale the hands to the hips. Exhale, shift the weight to the right. Inhale, lift your left knee up, plant the ball of your left foot on your block. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Option to stay right here just like this, or maybe you reach your arms all the way up into the air. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. Invitation to stay here, or if you want to challenge your balance, you'll lift your left foot off the block, finding your variation of stork pose. So that's an example of how I teach stork in progressions. Here's how I would teach eagle pose in progressions. Starting in mountain pose, make sure the 2 blocks are on either side of the feet. I'm going to start here on the medium height, but they can be on any of the 3 heights. Inhale, hands to the hips. Exhale, bend the knees, sit the hips back. Inhale, shift the weight to the left. Exhale, lift your right leg up, cross it over your left, place the ball of your right foot on your block. Take a deep breath in and a deep breath out. Option to stay right here just like this and just work the legs. Or if you want a little challenge, you can add the arms. Inhale the arms wide. Exhale, give yourself a hug. Right arm comes on top of left. Draw the elbows away from the body. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. If this feels super easy for you and you want to challenge your balance, invitation to lift your right toes off the block, finding your variation of eagle pose. Deep breath in. Deep breath out. So there's an example of how I might teach eagle pose in 3 progressions in a beginner yoga class. Tip number 4, teach accessible transitions. Now, have you ever noticed it's super hard for your yoga students to kick their leg through from downward facing dog? What tends to happen is their leg gets stuck and then they feel like yoga isn't for them and they feel defeated and embarrassed. So I tend to not teach that transition at all in a beginner yoga class. Instead, to get to my low lunge poses, I always teach the transition from tabletop. So tabletop, extend the leg back, draw the knee to the nose, step the foot through. Now, if you have blocks at the studio that you teach, I definitely recommend teaching that with your hands-on blocks like I've shown already, but I definitely recommend this variation instead. But this is the transition that I like to use to get to low lunge poses. Now to get to standing poses, instead of kicking the leg through downward facing dog, which is really, really hard, I simply like to have my students start in mountain pose and then step back into their standing poses. And then they step back forward. So those are the two main transitions that I really like to teach in beginner yoga classes. Now, between sections of class, it's okay if your class is choppy or it doesn't flow. And so what I mean by that is my structure of a beginner yoga class is this. We always start with a grounding and tune-in, then we go to the warm-up, then tabletop and low lunge poses, then standing poses, then balancing poses, then a cool down, and then shavasana. So in between your balancing pose and your cool down, how are you going to get from standing to a C or on your back or on your belly? I keep it simple and I just say, take a seat on the mat or make your way to your belly or come to lay on your back. In between the sections, it's okay to be choppy. It's okay for it not to flow. Your students can get there how they got to get there. Within the section of class, I like all of the poses to flow smoothly together. So what I mean by that is if we're in a warm-up section of the class, I like all of the warm-up poses to make a mini flow. It's not choppy. Everything is flowing together nice and pretty and smoothly. So that means I'm not going from on my back to seated to back on my back to then on my belly, right, in a warm-up, right? I'm keeping it so everything is flowing together smoothly and nicely within the section of class. But between the sections of class, it's totally okay for your beginner class to be choppy. You want the transitions to be accessible. You don't want your students to feel defeated or like they can't do yoga because you're doing a tricky transition to flow between sections of class. Tip number 5, create your own beginner yoga curriculum. Why? Because beginners need repetition to learn. So what I recommend is that you create your own beginner yoga curriculum that takes your yoga students on a journey of how to do all of the basic yoga poses and teaches them the basic yoga terms. So I want to make myself clear. I'm not saying teach the same class with the same sequence week after week after week. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that you create your own curriculum where you have the same sequencing format and structure each week, but you change the poses and the sequences that you're doing within that format. And if you're wondering like, what is a good yoga sequencing format for beginners? I do have free templates inside of my Sequencing 101 ebook. If you haven't got that, I definitely recommend that you download it. And there you'll get my free beginner yoga class template. You also get templates for all levels in Vinyasa Flow as well. So back to how to build your beginner yoga curriculum. Step number 1 is for you to write down all of the basic yoga poses. I want you to list out all of the basic yoga poses and categorize them by section of class. So what are the basic yoga poses that you might do in a warm-up? What are the basic yoga poses that you might do in tabletop and low lunge section of class? What are the basic yoga poses that you might do in the standing section of class? What are the basic yoga poses that you might do in the balancing section of class? What are the basic yoga poses that you might do in a cool down? And then step number 2 is to pick your duration of your curriculum. I recommend between 4 to 8 weeks. So say you want it 4 weeks, it can be 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever works for you. And then what you're going to do is